Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar. I'm David Feist and will be the facilitator of the webinar today. Our presenters are Paul Matera and Keith Mowry. Um, Thank you for joining ANAB for our complimentary webinar on an update to the revision of ISO IEC 17020 Draft International Standard Ballot. Please note we are recording this webinar so it will be available for viewing in the future. A couple things on logistics that we'd like to talk about before we get started. Due to our anticipated high attendance, everyone will remain muted for the duration of the webinar. Please enter your questions in the question and answer box you'll see on your screen. We've planned time at the end of the webinar to answer questions asked. So let's talk about our two presenters. Paul Matera is an ANAB Senior Accreditation Manager, and he heads up our inspection body program and is a US expert to the ISO CASCO Working Group 31, currently revising ISO IEC 17020. Paul serving in the drafting group in the Working Group 31 and represents ANAB on the ILAC Inspection Committee, as well as other inspection committees for other regional cooperation bodies worldwide. He has over 30 years in the inspection field and is considered an expert. Now let's talk about Keith Mowry. He is a Senior Manager of Business Development with ANAB. He is our representative on the ANSI International Conformity Assessment Committee, the National Mirror Committee to ISO CASCO. He has served as chair of that committee for over 20 years and has over 30 years experience with ISO standards and guides for conformity assessment. Both of these individuals are highly skilled in their fields. I'm going to turn the presentation over to Keith Mowry at this time. Let's see. Keith, you are now the presenter.
Terrific. Thanks so much, David, and hi to everybody who's joined us. I'm just going to speak for a couple of minutes to put us in context within the ISO process. And the bulk of our time today, we're going to hear from Paul, who's going to be talking about the specific areas of revision for 17020. So within ISO, regardless of whether ISO is developing a new standard or revising an existing standards, the ISO directives, the rules for ISO standards development, define 6 stages that a document goes through to be created or revised as an international standard. And the first stage is called the proposal stage, and the last stage is the publication stage. Publication is where ISO does all their magic and starts the printing presses or arranges all the electrons and gets the document, sent out to all of us. And so, that's the beginning and the end, the proposal and the publication stage. The real heart of the process are the 4 stages in between, and they have names. The preparatory stage, the committee stage, the enquiry stage, and the approval stage. And these are the formal names for these stages in the directives. But really what most of the people use to identify these stages are the types of drafts that are produced within the stage. So for example, while the ISO directives call it the preparatory stage, the kind of draft that's created during that stage is a working draft. And you can see in parentheses here on the slides the type of draft that is produced in each stage. And the name of those drafts are the kind of the usual shorthand way that people refer to what stage of development a document or revision is within. Now, the directives themselves actually only require 3 stages. The proposal stage and the publication stage, that kind of makes sense. How could you have a new document or a revised document if you don't start and if you don't end? So that the 2 proposal and publication stage, those are easy to understand why they're mandatory. But really in the middle, the ISO directives under certain circumstances only require the enquiry stage, the draft international standard stage, to be completed. Now, within ISO CASCO, however, the usual stages that a new document, a new standard, or a revision of a standard go through are the three that we have highlighted here in blue: the working draft, the committee draft, and the draft international standard stage. So what Paul's going to talk to us about now is the draft international standards ballot that has been issued by CASCO for 17020. So we are in this third blue step. And the draft international standard document that was circulated with this ballot is what Paul is going to be talking about today. So at this point, let me hand it over to Paul, who's got the inside poop on some of the issues and interesting revisions that are happening in the DIS.
Paul, you're now the presenter.
Thanks, guys, and welcome to everybody on the call, on the webinar. Thank you, Keith. I've been involved with Keith and doing this with the CASCO, ISO CASCO for several years now, and I learned something from him every time we talk about it. So he's been around doing that for a long time. All right, so let's get on to it. I've been involved in the work group since, I think it was April of 2023 is when I first was nominated as the US expert to the group. And so we've been meeting in Switzerland and online, every few months through from then till now. And we had a lot of revision. We had a lot of stuff that we had to deal with. We had over 1,200 comments that we had to go through one by one from all the various regional bodies and the country, like the ICAC, like what Keith represents. So each one of those countries had a lot of input, and so we had to go through each one of those items one by one and discuss them, debate them, and they are the reason why things changed in the standard. So it wasn't just a bunch of people that got together because they were bored and decided to do it. It was the various stakeholders around the world that use the standard, both accreditation bodies, governments, and stakeholders that decided that there was some sort of confusion or things weren't stated correctly or they were being misapplied. So that's how we got to where we are today. So we're in the draft international, the DIS stage. So that means that we have another final set of feedback that we're going to get from the ICACs, and we're going to take those comments and we're going to come up with hopefully the part that'll be published. So one of the first things that we see in the new standard, the DIS, is a new title: Requirements for Bodies Performing Inspections. So that's a slightly different title than the one before. So you'll see a new title. Also, I want to mention that anything that we talk about here is essentially still in draft stage. So try to avoid taking this information and running back to whoever or in your own stuff and saying, this is what's going to happen. Because what this is what is being proposed. And because of the length of the document, I won't be going into extreme specifics. That will come later once the document is published and it's finalized. You can come back here to us and we will provide updated, much more in-depth training for that. So yeah, we have a new title. We have what's called the Common Elements, Proc 33, which affected just about every section. So I listed out there on the screen the sections that the common elements were inserted into, and those common elements are things that all of the 17,000 series standards are trying to get to be equivalent to each other. So like if you have a 17025 and you have 17020, certain sections are going to be identical. So that's to try to help with companies that have multiple standards so they don't have to necessarily have very different quality management systems. So we'll start with the terms and definitions. So updates and clarifications were requested for many of the definitions. So there are some changes in the DIS. We wanted to try to align the new document with the ISO 17000 2020. So the 17,000 is, of course, basically the definitions, the terminology in the ISO CASCO world. And so that came out in 2020, the latest revision. Our current 17020 is 2012. And so we wanted to make sure that we updated it with the latest terminology. So we specifically, this impacts definitions for inspection, inspection scheme, partiality, and appeal. We removed product, process, service, and inspection system, and we added definitions for client and item. So for the term inspection, we changed what was product, process, and service to a more general term of item. There was a lot of discussion around this on what that meant. And so we came to this because it was more of a generic term for items inspected. Because we are inspecting products, sometimes we're inspecting processes, sometimes services. And so we changed it to the term item because it ties in neatly with some of the other changes we did elsewhere in the document. We also decided to make sure that we retain the definition of inspection it may or may not include determination of conformity. I believe in the DIS it did end up, conformity is mentioned. However, it's mentioned that you're not necessarily providing an inspection to determine conformity. Sometimes you're just inspecting it for informational purposes, just to give a report back. So previously it was sort of implied that you had to come up with a determination of conformity, and that's not necessarily the case. Inspection scheme aligns more closely, again, with 17,000 2020 definition, and we combine some elements of the deleted inspection system term. Partiality and appeal, again, we wanted to align those better with 17,000. Partiality is now more directly related to the term impartiality is more directly related to impartiality with regards to the outcome of the inspection. We've removed references to independent as it relates to impartiality. You'll see in the new standard that there is a separation now of impartiality and independence. It used to be lumped together. A lot of people had it in their heads that it was essentially the same thing, but we made a lot of effort in this standard to separate those two concepts. And you'll see later as we talk about it that essentially everybody has to be impartial, but independence depends really on the situation you're in, the company you're working for, the contractual relationship between you and whoever is asking for the inspection to be completed. Appeal now ties to a decision, and it identifies more clearly who can make an appeal. New definition. So we have a new term, client, which relates to who can make an appeal. And this opens up the concept as to who is considered a client. And we added a bunch of notes to help flush that out, give examples of who the client is for an inspection body. So that's relative to who is going to ask us as an inspection body to do inspections, which then, of course, ties into independence. Item, anything that can be inspected. Seems simple, like a simple concept, but you'd be surprised how much this was argued over those in the last couple of years. So it's anything that is to be inspected based on the requirement or client agreement. So that's important. For those of you on the call that have been doing inspections a while to a standard, you know that if you inspect an item, does that mean and then you write a report, does that mean you're inspecting that one item, or does that represent a population of a larger set of items, right? So we've got to deal with that. and notes were added to that definition to try and help flush that out for everybody. Competence. So, again, we try to comply or come into line with other standards. Competence isn't defined in necessarily in 17,000, but it is in 1721 and 24 and 27. So we basically took those from those other standards and we applied it to the competence that we see or expect from an inspector standpoint. All right, clause 4. So Proc 33 reared its ugly head here in clause 4. So there was fairly major rewrite there, just bringing in that standard information. And so then we had to do a lot of rewriting around the rest of the clause to accommodate Proc 33 information. And that's something you'll see throughout the standard. And there was a lot of confusion out there in the world about types A, B, and C. B and C didn't neatly fit into a lot of buckets. And so there was a lot of concern about how to properly evaluate that and all the different nuances that all the different types of inspection bodies have in their businesses. It was difficult. So we addressed that. So some of the proposed changes are around independence and impartiality. We separated them out, presented them as disconnected concepts. So just went into that a little bit a minute ago. We separated the clauses from partiality. Proc 33 did that, and independence, we moved that over to clause 5. And then we added additional notes to what constitutes a legally enforceable commitment. So remember, we had the one note about, as an example, it could be a contract. We've added additional notes with additional examples because people were focused in on that contract and felt that was the only thing, because that was what the note said in the standard. Even though we all know that a note is not a requirement, it still weighs heavily on how people interpret the requirement. So we tried to add additional flexibility there. So clarity and applicability to global inspection bodies was the reasons, if we could boil down all the comments about clause 5, that's basically what we were getting. We were just getting a lot of, people needed clarity on very specific terminology in clause 5. And a lot of the global inspection bodies, sometimes through just translation of the English language into theirs, some things lost their meaning or had a different meaning in most cases, or different cultures and different economies and different legislation are impacted differently by these clauses. And so we try to help accommodate a wider audience. So to do that, we added more examples and notes in most of the subclauses in clause 5. Again, we moved independence into clause 5. We reference to Annex A in the independence clause now, and the big news, type A and non-type A are now the only types of independence. So, well, proposed, because this is a draft. So what that means is either you're type A, which is still basically the same type A as it was. We did add additional notes to that. I'll talk about that here in a minute. And then non-type A. So either you are type A or you're not. And so we tried to also make sure that it wasn't projected that a non-type A was a lesser type of inspection body, because they are just as important and just as critical to how we do things in the world as a type A. They just simply have a different type of independence. So they may be a wholly owned internal inspection body inspecting their own product. So they don't have the independence of somebody that is not owned by a company that has the product that they're inspecting. But everybody's expected to be impartial. So more clarity around legal entities and relationships to other bodies and other internal groups that may impact independence or impartiality. So those are different concepts. So there are as I just alluded to, there are so many different kinds of inspection bodies out there in the world that are created and accommodate their local economy and how things are run in that part of the world. And there were so many shades of gray on that that's what we came up with based on the feedback we were getting from various stakeholders around the world. So we dropped the deputy technical manager. We replaced with requirements for technical management. So there's not really any more kind of an individual that's a technical manager. Now there certainly could be in your company, but it's really more around the concept of technical management. We added additional clarity to the minimum requirements of technical management. And we decided that we want to make sure that the responsibilities that are listed out in the standard for technical management don't bleed over into like contract review for collections, or just some of the other administrative or the things the CFO may worry about, or risk that's not technically related may worry about. Technical management should be worrying about the technical aspects of the contract. Is the scope laid out correctly, and things like that. The technical aspects of training their people. So, the technical manager shouldn't be responsible to make sure that they've taken, tolerance training, but they do need to make sure that they are technically trained. So the technical management portion of the standard, we try to have it focus in a little bit more on those technical managers and what they're likely to be in charge of and what they should be looking after to make sure that the inspection body has the technical competency that the world assumes they have. And clarification for requirements of the organizational structure and the duties for key personnel within it is something that we've updated as well. So again, for clause 6, Proc 33 required that we change things up, and 17025 compatibility. So, in chapter 6, in clause 6, we talked a lot about equipment. Of course, with equipment comes a slew of other requirements, especially in 17025. And we had addressed that previously in the current version of 17020, but we felt, and as a group, the comments reflected a need to bring things a little bit more in line with 17025 when equipment is involved. So we'll go into that here. So we blended Proc 33 boilerplate stuff for competence with the existing text. So it doesn't really say something very different, but it is a little different. So once it's issued, we'll all have to go through that and to determine what competence is relative to us. So documented information demonstrating competence of personnel is now required. That wasn't explicitly called out previously. So we'll once this thing is issued, we'll deal with that. On-site monitoring of personnel has expanded significantly. Now, we always had the ILAC P15 elements that were always out there, but now we've tried to incorporate those more directly into the standard. So some of those examples that ILAC P15 had given us are now directly incorporated into the standard. Also, just as a general side note, we had a concerted effort to try to get as much of ILAC P15 into the new standard as possible. Didn't always work, but it, we got what we could in there. So I'm being told that my audio is inconsistent. So I will try to maybe speak a little louder. All right, clause 6. So again, facilities and equipment similar to 17025. Calibrated or traceable equipment text was added. So if you're familiar with 17025, a lot of this stuff will be familiar to you. Externally provided resources, again, similar to 17025. more explicitly and clearly states that the inspection body must be competent to perform a scope item itself. And the term exceptional circumstances is now used when determining if the inspection body is going to subcontract work out. So in the current version of the standard, a lot of companies would essentially subcontract entire, regions out to subcontract people. So either companies or individuals. So that's not explicitly forbidden, but those types of situations now fall under the term exceptional circumstance. So that will be something that we're going to have to work through as accreditation bodies and inspection bodies to make sure we come together on what exactly that means. So that should be something that impacts some regions more than others. There's also a major rewrite in terms of how the section is worded, as in clause 6. And this was a result of the Proc 33 wording. It's just basically, because the wording was so very specific, it kind of threw some other clauses that were in there that weren't impacted by the Proc 33, but the Proc 33 wording was now replaced, so we had to reword everything else. So you're going to see clause 6 is rearranged. The numbering is not what it was, and there are some additional nuanced things that are different from before. All right, that takes us to clause 7. Again, why change anything? Proc 33, and then there was a need for clarity around the contracting and the work order control. That generated a lot of comments, so we had to deal with that. So we tried to provide updates for clarity regarding the acceptance and monitoring of the performance of work. So no major changes there, but just a lot of what we hope is a lot more clarity on what the standard is looking for in that. Same thing around inspections to be performed, the contracting issues around how those inspections are contracted, and how samples are treated. So there's a lot more clarity, what we feel, in there about sampling and how to contract inspections. So there's also additional requirements now for reporting that weren't there before. So when the final final version comes out, that will be something that we're going to need to evaluate and make sure we get incorporated into our report templates and so forth. And now there's an updated appeals and complaints sections as well. So that'll be something that when that comes out, we're going to have to take a look and review your policies and make those adjustments. So inspection methods and procedures now have a specific minimum requirement. Sampling is now addressed more directly in the standard than it was before. There was a very large push from certain regions of the world where they felt sampling was underrepresented. They were well represented on the work group, and so they got that included. So sampling was always kind of there, it just wasn't really addressed that directly. So now it is. And on the inspection methods and procedures, we now have a list of things that your inspection method and procedure shall have, things that it shall address. So just like some of the other parts of the standard where it's very prescriptive on what a procedure is supposed to include, well, now your inspection methods and procedures have that same type of list. So non-standard inspection methods now must be validated. That's new with accompanying records. So when you think about that and you let it soak in a little bit, you think about all your inspection methods that you've got for your scope, they all have to be validated and they have to have records. And so the first thing that somebody's going to ask is, well, how the heck do I validate that? Well, that's going to be up to the inspection body to determine how best to validate it. I think as the standard comes out and that particular clause gets kicked around and people get used to it, I think the industry will eventually come up with a way to do it for certain methods. But if it's non-standard, that means it's not something that's normal, and so the people that are creating that inspection method should have a way to be able to verify that it's a good method. So new technology and inspections, drones, AI, etc. You're going to start to see that in the standards. We wanted to address it more directly, but you know, Bill Gates wasn't available to talk to us about AI, so we had to go with what we had, which was not much. We just know that people are using drones and AI now currently and robotics in inspection. That's a fact. Some of the people on the committee work for inspection bodies that are currently using drones and AI to do inspections. So we have to address it. But we are not AI experts, so we couldn't address it specifically. So basically, we've just added some stuff to say, if you're using these sort of things in your inspection procedures, make sure you verify, validate, and make sure that the decision-making components are appropriate. So new frontiers there. All right, Clause 8. Again, why change anything? Proc 33 once again, and content from other 17,000 standards. So there's been a major realignment in Clause 8 stuff for several years now. And so all of the new 17,000 series that are coming out are starting to become a lot more similar in Clause 8. Like 17025, when it came out in 2017, you know, it updated, and the new 17020 is no different. So the big changes, though, are options A and B have been dropped in that Proc 33 text. So you're no longer option A or option B. ISO 9001 is still mentioned. Clarifying conditions for meeting the Clause 8 requirements via an ISO 9001 compliant QMS is still there, but we've clarified the conditions. So basically, you're still supposed to go through and verify that the inspection bodies comply with all the various sections of Clause 8. And the way it was written in the 2012 version, you could sort of read it to say, if you had a 9001, you didn't even have to worry about the rest of the Clause 8. And that was never the case. So we've clarified that, and we've de-emphasized the ISO 9001. It's still in there because ISO sells a lot of those. So, you know, we couldn't get it taken out, but it's not as confusing, we hope. Text for risks and opportunities improvement was borrowed from other 17,000 series standards. So for those of you with multi-standards, you're going to see some similarity there. Preventative actions was deleted. Actions to address risks and opportunities was added. So preventative actions sort of equates into actions to address risks and opportunities. So, you know, we felt that we were really just aligning the standards and not really eliminating a major concept. So a new section on ensuring the validity of inspection results was added. It looks a lot like the PT ILC and ISO 17025, ILAC P9, and P15. So that's going to be something that may take a little getting used to. The control of documents and records clauses are now combined into one clause. And good news for some people, the removal of the 12-month requirement for management reviews. So it now reads very similar to the internal audits. So it just has to be done on a planned interval. How that's going to shake out and how it's going to go down with assessment accreditation bodies and stuff, I have a feeling it'll depend a lot on the number of nonconformities and the problems during an assessment relative to the compliance with the standard. So I think for companies that say, well, we're going to do it every 5 years, and they get, 15 nonconformities, well, maybe they shouldn't wait every 5 years to do that sort of stuff. So that should be interesting. The new Annex A. So we now have Type A and non-Type A, period. So the Type A component of the old Annex A is essentially intact, but we added more notes and more examples, and we tried to be more clear on what exactly Type A is and what it isn't, because we know that's going to be a key thing for a lot of people. Again, independence is what Annex A is all about. It's not about impartiality. So we've removed impartiality from Annex A because everybody has to be impartial, and the definition is already taken care of in the body of the standard. And we added Annex C. So basically we took what the part of Annex A that used to describe Type B and Type C, and we created an Annex C to help people transition from what a Type B or C was into a non-Type A. So for a lot of companies, it won't be a hard transition at all. It's the same thing. They haven't changed. They're just simply called something else. But we had a lot of governments that have, especially in Europe, that have legislation that specifically specify a Type B inspection body. And so now that we've eliminated that, that created an issue. So Annex C was provided to, we created that to try to help alleviate that transition. All right, so that's the end for me, and this is going to be back over to Keith for him to explain what happens next.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And let me encourage everybody. We've got that Q&A box. That's the place to put your questions that we'll discuss at the end of the presentation. And I'm just going to take a couple minutes now to talk about what happens from here. And as Paul said, very clearly and very accurately, what we have in front of us today that's been put out for ballot is a draft. It is not the end of the road necessarily. At the same time, it's not the first draft, right? If you remember those stages, inside the working group themselves, the working group created, I think, one or more working drafts of the revision that they kicked around and thought about inside the working group. And then they published for ballot a committee draft. And that was distributed to all the national member committees of ISO all over the world, all the members in liaison, and everybody had a chance to throw in all the comments they wanted to make about that committee draft. That was what Paul was referring to when he said that we get 1,200 comments to deal with, and that's a lot. And so now, as a result of both those stages, now we're in the draft international standard stage. And yes, what we have is a draft. But you can see it's maturing, right? You can see it's developing. And really, this particular draft international standard stage is a ballot, like the committee draft stage. And so the national member bodies to CASCO have a draft international standard document showing all the proposed revisions to 17020. And in this stage, those national members of ISO, including the United States, and all the countries that are members that participate in CASCO, we're going to vote. Each country is going to vote, literally, to either approve or disapprove this draft international document that we've seen. And in addition to a vote, each member country can also submit comments about this draft that Paul has referenced. Now, if a country votes to disapprove the draft, they are obligated to provide comments. In other words, they have to say, well, here's our comments about why we disapprove this document. And for those that vote to approve, they can submit comments if they wish, but they don't have to. Now, if you've been on these webinars before, you know you've heard me say that the reality in ISO CASCO is for decades that all ISO CASCO ballots get approved. As a matter of fact, in the 30 plus years that I've been involved, I've only seen one ballot of a document that didn't get approved. Now, like the financial people say, right? A past performance is not an indicator of future performance, but still, there it is, and it's real. So, if the document is approved in this ballot, if the majority of the members of these national mirror committees, if they vote to approve that document, then will the disposition of the comments require technical changes to the draft? And what I mean by this last box is, so if the tally of the ballot of all the CASCO members is to approve the document, which is almost always the case, then what the working group is going to face is they're going to face that reality that the ballot was, okay, all the majority of members approved this ballot, but we also have comments, and these comments are probably going to be suggestions to change some things in the draft. And so now the working group's going to be kind of in a dilemma, right? In all likelihood, the working group's on the one hand is going to say, well, we've got a draft that was balloted and was approved. But on the other hand, we have these comments. Now, they will look at the comments and they will deliberate about whether the comments need to be acted on, meaning any further changes are needed to the draft that's currently out for ballot now. But the interesting part here is if the working group doesn't make any technical changes to the draft that's currently balloted, right? If they make no technical changes, then per the ISO rules, the document's going to go straight to publication, which means we're done. And the next thing that we see is a revised International Standard 17020. Now, if in considering the comments, the working group decides that, well, you know, there's some valid comments here, and we have to make some technical changes to this version that we're seeing in front of us now, this current version that's out for ballot. If they do make technical changes, then they cannot go straight to publication. They have to go to that last stage, that final draft international standard, or FDIS ballot stage. So you see what the incentives are, right? If you're the working group, you have an incentive to say, you know, if we don't make any technical changes, we can go straight to publication and we can be done. And, you know, we each get a little star on our report card for getting done sooner rather than later. And so does that become a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy? Does that introduce a bias in the working group, particularly if the ballot results are to approve? Does it introduce kind of a fait accompli, if you will, that it's going to go straight to publication? Well, it can. I'm not predicting that it's going to happen. I'm just trying to give you some context that there is that kind of momentum or that kind of incentive. So if the draft goes straight to publication, okay, there's a vote to approve, and the working group looks at all the comments and decides, you know, we don't really need to make any technical changes. In that scenario, the publication goes straight to publication. The difference between the DIS that people can see today and that published international standard is only going to be non-technical or probably editorial changes. So yes, what we're seeing today is still a draft. It still can change, but in the overall context of the process, we've reached a state of maturity where there is a reasonable possibility that what we're seeing in this DIS is in effect, other than maybe editorial changes, could be what we see when the revised standard is published. So that's why we want to give you this context of the process, and we want you to be aware of that so that you can have a sense of where things stand and how close we might be based on past experience with CASCO and based on the ISO rules, how close we actually might be to seeing content that's pretty solid that might be reflected in that revised standard. No promises, no guarantees, but for those of you who have to plan and understand those changes and implement fulfillment of the new standard, we hope that context is valuable. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to David to see if we have questions. David, are you with us? We can't hear you.
Yeah,
the mute button strikes again.
Yeah, what can I say? Hey, thank you, Keith and Paul. What a great presentation. We have had quite a few questions come through, and we're going to get to those right after we discuss just a couple of additional resources that we have. Within within ANAB, we do webcasts, which are free. These webinars are free, and we've had a number of questions come in. This will be posted, as all of our webinars are posted on the ANAB website, and they are free for you to view and share with your colleagues at any time. We do this as a service to the accreditation community. The ANAB blog page has a wealth of information related to risk, accreditation, standards requirements, and ANAB offers live online, in-person, and self-paced training in many areas: internal auditing, standard requirements, measurement confidence, risk analysis, uncertainty, proficiency testing, etc. So let's get to some of the questions that have come in. Um, we've had a number of them, Paul and Keith, which have come in regarding proficiency testing, and specifically, does the new version of ISO IEC 17020 require the participation of inspection bodies in proficiency, ILC? Because as it stands right now, it's not doesn't really seem to be addressed well. And Paul, I think this is going to come to you. Paul, you're muted.
Yeah. So I agree with with the comment about how ILAC P9 it's not super clear, and that's true. So yes, the short answer is yes, but there's always a but. It's really going to be relative to what you're doing in your inspection body, and if it applies. It kind of falls more around the verification and validation that your inspection procedures are appropriate to what you're trying to inspect. So, I think people realize that it may not always be appropriate, and therefore, each accreditation body, I believe, is going to have to take in and issue memorandum on what that's going to mean within their inspection body program. I just updated ours, and I did address much more directly in our AR 2252 what that is going to mean, because ILAC has had policies out there for quite some time now, and they are still in play. I mean, P9 and G27 are still, the most current versions and are in place. So the standard did try to incorporate some of that language in. So yes, I would be taking a look at that within your systems to see where it's appropriate, where it's not, and to just have some documentation and maybe a risk analysis created to back up your decisions on what you're going to do on that. But yeah, it's in clause 8 now, and it's not super specific because of the nature of inspection relative to PT and ILC. So we couldn't be like as specific as we are with 17025, because in many cases, most cases, I would say, there is not commercially available PT for an inspection. And I think a lot of people could argue that it's not even relative. I mean, you can't even do it, but in other things you can. So because the document is supposed to encompass all inspections everywhere in the world of all types, we have to have something in there that would accommodate those situations where PT or ILC is relative and is impactful. So yes, it is in there now when it was not really in there before.
Thank you, Paul. Next question. Do you have a date we should expect the standard to be published?
I think either myself or Keith can answer that. I would say, for my part, we don't even look at the DIS until September. So currently, the schedule has it out at the end of this year. But Keith has been on a couple of these committees, and so he's, he knows also that things kind of go sideways. So Keith, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. So the working group is going to get together in September, like Paul says, and that's when they're going to, and in advance of that working group meeting, I assume, they're going to get all the comments that were submitted, and they'll see the vote. and the vote
Yeah,
is
we
what it is.
have drafting group meetings before that.
Right, yeah, so they will start to work through all the comments before that September meeting. And so at the September meeting, that's kind of the key point that I described in the second part of the last part of the presentation. That's where that decision is going to be made by the working group. Are there comments that justify making technical changes? What are those technical changes? Yes, no, maybe so. And if there aren't, right, and the document can go straight to publication after that September meeting, then yeah, typically it's a couple of months that ISO needs to do their editing work and do all the steps that they follow when something's ready to be published. And therefore, end of the year, November, December, sure, that makes sense. If the working group meeting in September decides, no, gosh, there's just a couple things we can't just make these non-technical, this is a substantive change, then there will be this final draft international standard stage ballot that I referenced. Now that ballot is relatively short. And because by then the thing is supposed to be pretty much baked, right? The cake is done, and even the icing's on. It's just one last, formal yes or no, up or down vote. And so, if the document does go to FDIS, then I would expect that ballot would go out in early October and conclude maybe middle of November. And so a couple of months after that, assuming the FDIS is approved, it probably will be, then you're into maybe January, February of 2026. So there's not really a big difference, right? So it's end of this year, beginning of next year for publication. And of course, for those who are accredited to 17020, then of course ILAC needs to meet and decide about what kind of transition period all the accreditation bodies are going to use to in terms of accrediting to the new revision. And for those who are not accredited, then it's up to you about your own fulfillment, about how you transition and how you understand and implement those whatever requirements are new or different.
Okay, thank you. With the change in title to the standard, is this an indication that it may be less applicable in the forensics community in the future?
Sure, I'll take a stab at that. The change in title, I'm looking at the old title right now. Yeah, the old title was Requirements for the Operation of Various Types of Bodies Performing Inspection. And that's kind of long. That title may be 30 years old. And the new title on the DIS is Requirements for Bodies Performing Inspection. I would say that the indication that you should take from the title and the content that goes along under this new title is that the standard is more broadly applicable. And I'll share this. In other areas of conformity assessment outside of inspection, particularly in product certification, there is often a need for a requirements document for a conformity assessment body doing an activity, but there is no dedicated, identified ISO IEC standard for that kind of a body. Let me give you an example. Sometimes in product certification or in other areas, there's a need to do design review. That's a conformity assessment activity within a conformity assessment scheme. And so the question comes up, well, where is the requirements document for the body that's performing design review? And of course, we look at the ISO IEC standards that are published from ISO CASCO, and we don't have one. There is no requirements document for a body performing design review as a conformity assessment activity. And in those cases, and very often in those cases, then what users do is they look at what's available from ISO CASCO and they kind of choose the best fit standard for a body doing that kind of activity. And in many, many cases, in many instances, that best fit standard is ISO IEC 17020. Because inspection, as Paul alluded to so many times in his comments, it covers a really broad range of activities, just what everybody thinks about as inspection. Inspection itself covers an incredibly broad range of activities. And if you really stretch your imagination, so to speak, you can kind of see that you could even call design review as maybe something called inspection, or the review of literature, like a use and care manual that goes along with a product. If that has to be evaluated, you could kind of think of that as inspection. And this very broad characteristic, this broad applicability of 17020 from the past, I think is not only continued in the current document, it's actually expanded. And so I think 17020 is even more applicable as a very broad kind of catch-all document for bodies doing conformity assessment activities. And the new title, I think, is indicative of that. So, for forensics and other areas, I would say that it will be just as applicable, if not more so, than the old standard. That's my perspective anyway.
Yeah, and we specifically in the working group, that was one of our goals, was to broaden the applicability of the standard, because we felt that the 2012 version was a little bit too focused on certain industries and didn't take into account a lot of the other industries that now that the standard's been around a while, that it's being used for. So yes, we tried to open it up to more usage.
Perfect. There have been several questions regarding the DIS itself, whether it's available to interested parties in the U.S. and how they would comment back to you or the committee, or do they need to purchase the DIS version?
Sure, I'll answer that. And so now we're going to get into some nuts and bolts about standards development and ANSI here in the U.S. ISO standards that achieve or balloted at this DIS stage, right? The DIS versions of those standards are listed in the weekly publication of ANSI Standards Action. ANSI Standards Action is a big, long, hundreds of pages every week of all the different kind of standards activities that are going on under the ANSI umbrella, including notification of DIS versions of ISO standards. I believe the notification for the DIS for 17020 has already been published in one of those ANSI standards actions. Now, let me give you a tip here. You can go to the ANSI standards action website, and the good news is you don't have to search through each individual weekly publication of standards action. You can actually type in ISO IEC DIS 17020 as your search parameter, and the web page will go and back and look at all the previous ANSI standards action publications. And the benefit of that is when you find it, you will be given information about how you can purchase a copy of the DIS. Okay, so the DIS, now the committee drafts, right? Those CD versions, they're not notified in ANSI standards action, and certainly the working drafts that are considered just inside the working group, those are never notified in ANSI standards action. As a matter of fact, nobody outside the working group even knows about them. So if you want to get a copy of the DIS, you can purchase that. Now, I forget, I'll be the first to admit, I forget whether ANSI standards action also provides you a pathway to submit comments. Go check it out. I don't think it does, but don't take my word for it. Really, the answer to that is if you want the free copy of the DIS and you want to be able to be submitting comments, then that's when you decide to join the ANSI National Mirror Committee to ISO CASCO, the ANSI International Conformity Assessment Committee. And you can Google that. You can Google ANSI International Conformity Assessment Committee or ANSI ICAC, and then you can find information about who to contact if you're interested in becoming a member and participating. Now, it's structured and operated like a U.S. tag, and like other U.S. tags, there are fees to participate each year. But but certainly you can join, and that way you get all the DIS versions for free, and you do have that opportunity to comment.
Perfect. Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for your time. That we've taken up our entire webinar space with questions. If you have information related to training, you can contact training@anab.org. If you want to talk about accreditation services, you can contact ANAB.
Well,
Well,
for everybody, I think we lost David's audio. If you're interested in accreditation,